I'm Elsie, 36 female. I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood in a house my husband Jacob and I bought 5 years ago. I'm a landscape architect, and our backyard, with its custom-designed pool and garden, is my pride and joy. For years, it was a sanctuary, but that was before it became the stage for a betrayal that would unravel my entire life. My own husband and his family, who had enjoyed my generosity for years, turned on me over something as trivial as a camping tent, revealing a depth of cruelty I never imagined. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The first Saturday of June always marked the unofficial start of summer in our family, and it always began with the same ritual, the grand opening of my pool. For the past 4 years, my sister-in-law, Bethany, would call me the week before, her voice syrupy sweet, asking if it was okay for her to host a small birthday party for her eldest, followed by weekly pool days for her 3 rambunctious kids. And every year, I'd say yes. I loved my nieces and nephew, and frankly, I felt a pang of sympathy for Bethany. She and her husband were always struggling financially, and their cramped apartment didn't have so much as a balcony, let alone a backyard. My pool was their summer oasis. This year was no different. The party was a chaotic explosion of screaming children, half-eaten hot dogs, and a sticky film of melted popsicles coating the patio stones I had meticulously laid myself. I spent the day refilling drinks, handing out towels, and playing lifeguard, while Bethany sat under the large patio umbrella with her mother, Rosie, scrolling through her phone and gossiping. My husband, Jacob, floated on an inflatable lounger, a beer in hand, occasionally shouting half-hearted warnings to the kids not to run. "You're a saint, Elsie," Rosie said to me as I handed her a glass of iced tea. "Bethany is so lucky to have a sister-in-law like you. This pool is a godsend." I smiled a little tiredly. "It's no problem, the kids are having fun." "Still," Bethany chimed in, not looking up from her screen, "it must be nice to afford all this." There was a subtle edge to her voice, a familiar barb wrapped in a seemingly innocent observation. It was her specialty. I chose to ignore it, a skill I had honed over years of family gatherings. Jacob, however, chuckled. "Yeah, well, Elsie's the one with the fancy landscape architect career. I just sell insurance." It was a joke, but it stung. Jacob often made light of my career, framing it as a boutique hobby rather than the demanding, successful business I had built from the ground up. In reality, my income had paid for the down payment on our house and funded most of the renovations, including the pool he was currently enjoying. But in his family's eyes, I was just lucky, and he was the hardworking provider. The day ended as it always did, with me cleaning up the mess long after everyone had gone home. I fished soggy napkins out of the skimmer basket, scrubbed sticky fingerprints off the glass door, and collected a small mountain of discarded paper plates and plastic cups. Jacob had come outside to help for all of 5 minutes before declaring he was exhausted and retreating to the living room to watch sports. As I stood by the shimmering blue water, the setting sun casting long shadows across the lawn, I felt a familiar twinge of resentment. It wasn't about the cleaning, it was about the expectation. My generosity was no longer seen as a gift, but as an entitlement. Throughout June and July, the pattern continued. At least 3 times a week, Bethany would text me, "Kids are bored. Coming over for a swim?" It was never a question, always a declaration. She would arrive with her children, a bag of cheap snacks, and an air of ownership, setting up camp on my patio chairs as if they were her own. She never offered to help with the pool chemicals, the cleaning, or the increased electricity bill from running the pump constantly. When I once gently mentioned the cost of maintaining a pool, she'd scoffed. "Please, Elsie, with what you make, it's a drop in the bucket." Jacob always sided with her. "Don't be stingy, Elle," he'd say. "It's just family, what's the big deal?" The big deal was that my home no longer felt like my own. It had become a free-for-all public pool, and I was the unpaid manager. My quiet afternoons, sketching designs by the water, were replaced with the constant shrieks of children doing cannonballs. My peaceful garden was trampled by little feet chasing after a stray ball. I felt my patience wearing thin, the plaster on my polite smile beginning to crack. The breaking point, however, wouldn't come from a summer of thankless pool hosting. It would come from a simple request, a small ask for a reciprocal favor that would expose the rotten foundation upon which my marriage and my relationship with his family was built. The request was for a tent. A simple, $10 second-hand tent that would ultimately cost me my home, my husband, and my peace of mind, before leading me to a place of quiet, calculated revenge. It was the last week of July when my best friend, Rachel, and I decided to go on a weekend camping trip. We'd been planning it for months, a much-needed escape from work and family obligations. The only thing we were missing was a decent tent. I remembered that Bethany and her family had gone camping the previous year. "Just ask Bethany," Jacob had said dismissively when I mentioned it. "She's got that big tent they bought. It's probably just sitting in her storage locker." It seemed like a reasonable request. After all, I had given her family an entire summer of unlimited access to a luxury that cost me thousands of dollars to install and hundreds to maintain. Surely, she wouldn't mind lending me a tent for 2 nights. That evening, I decided to call her. The air was warm, and the sound of crickets chirped outside my office window. I could hear the faint sound of the TV from the living room, where Jacob was already settled in for the night. I took a deep breath, dialed her number, and prepared to be gracious. I had no idea that this simple phone call would be the first tremor in an earthquake that would level my entire world. "A tent?" Bethany's voice on the other end of the line was flat, devoid of its usual cloying sweetness. I had just spent 5 minutes making small talk, asking about the kids and her day, before finally getting to the point. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my tone light and casual. "Rachel and I are going camping up by the lake next weekend, and I remembered you guys have that big family tent. I was wondering if we could possibly borrow it. We'd only need it for 2 nights. There was a pause, long enough for me to hear the tinny sound of a game show in the background of her apartment. I could picture her perfectly. Slouched on her worn-out sofa, phone pressed to her ear, a look of mild irritation on her face. Then came the sneer, audible even through the phone. "Get your own damn stuff, Elsie. You're pathetic." The words hit me with the force of a physical slap. I was so stunned that for a moment I couldn't speak. Pathetic? I thought of the countless hours I'd spent supervising her children, the money I'd spent on snacks and drinks and extra floaties, the sheer invasion of my privacy I had tolerated all summer, all without a single complaint. I'm sorry," I stammered, my mind racing to comprehend the hostility. "I just thought, since I let you use the pool." "Oh, here we go," she cut me off, her voice dripping with scorn. "The pool? You're never going to let us forget that, are you? You hold that stupid pool over our heads like you're some kind of queen bestowing favors on the poor. It's a pool, Elsie. Get over yourself." Before I could even formulate a response, I heard my mother-in-law, Rosie, in the background. Her cackle was unmistakable. "Beggars can't be choosers, Elsie," she yelled, her voice thick with amusement. It was clear I was on speakerphone. They were enjoying this, turning my simple request into a moment of humiliation. My face burned. I felt a knot of anger and shame tighten in my stomach. "That's not fair, Bethany," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "That's not what I was doing at all. It was just a simple request." "Well, the answer is no," Bethany snapped. "Go buy your own tent. I'm sure you can afford it." And with that, she hung up. I stood in my quiet kitchen, the silence of the house pressing in on me. The phone felt cold in my hand. I could hear Jacob laughing at something on the TV in the other room, completely oblivious. I walked into the living room, my heart pounding in my chest. "I just spoke to your sister," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Oh yeah, did you get the tent?" he asked, his eyes still glued to the screen. "No," I said. She was incredibly rude. She called me pathetic and told me to get my own stuff. Your mom was there, laughing." Jacob finally looked away from the TV, an annoyed expression on his face. "Oh, come on, Elle, don't be so dramatic. You're probably exaggerating." "I'm not exaggerating, Jacob," I insisted, my voice rising. "She was horrible. After everything I've done for her this summer, after letting her and her kids treat my pool like their own personal country club, this is how she responds." He sighed, a long, put-upon sound that instantly invalidated my feelings. "Look, it's just a tent. Why are you making such a big deal out of it? Stop being such a mooch." Mooch. The word hung in the air between us, ugly and sharp. It was the same sentiment Bethany had expressed, just phrased differently. In their eyes, I wasn't being generous. I was a transactional lender, and by asking for something in return, I had violated some unspoken rule. But what had I been mooching? I was the one who owned the assets, the one who provided the favors. "A mooch," I repeated, my voice dangerously quiet. "I let your family use our pool, our home, all summer long. I don't ask for a dime. I clean up after them. I rearrange my work schedule to be here when they decide to show up unannounced. And when I ask to borrow a tent for 2 days, I'm the mooch." "It's my family, Elsie," he said, his voice hardening. "The pool is here. It's not like it costs you anything to let them swim." The willful ignorance of that statement was staggering. Of course it costs me something. It costs me time, money for chemicals, higher electricity bills, and my own peace and quiet. "Well, maybe you should have thought of that before you installed it," he retorted, turning back to the TV. The conversation, in his mind, was over. I stood there for a long moment, looking at the back of my husband's head. In that instant, I saw him with a terrifying clarity. He wasn't just oblivious, he was complicit. He enjoyed the benefits of my hard work, the nice house, the pool, the comfortable lifestyle. But when it came to defending me, to showing me a basic level of respect and partnership, he was completely absent. He would always choose them. His family was a unit, and I was an outsider, a resource to be exploited. I didn't say another word. I turned and walked back into the kitchen, my mind a maelstrom of hurt and fury. The camping trip was forgotten. All I could think about was the sneering sound of Bethany's voice, Rosie's mocking laughter, and the cold indifference in my husband's eyes. They had shown me exactly who they were. The problem was, I still had no idea just how far they were willing to go to punish me for daring to ask for something in return. My trip was in 2 days. I decided I would still go. I didn't need their tent. I would buy one myself. The thought of getting away, even just for a weekend, felt less like a vacation and more like a necessary escape. I needed space. I needed to breathe air that wasn't thick with their contempt. That night I slept in the guest room. I didn't want to be near Jacob. I didn't want him to touch me. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard their words echoing in my head: pathetic, beggar, mooch. The words were meant to diminish me, to make me feel small and needy. But as the hours of the night ticked by, something else began to bubble up through the hurt, a cold, hard resolve. They thought I was a pushover, a doormat. They were about to find out how wrong they were. The next day, I went to an outdoor supply store and bought the best 2-person tent they had, along with new sleeping bags and a small camp stove. It was an impulsive, expensive purchase, but it felt like an act of defiance. I was investing in my own independence. I packed my bags, my movements precise and deliberate. When Jacob asked what I was doing, I told him I was still going on the camping trip. "With what tent?" he scoffed. "I bought one," I replied evenly. He just shook his head, a smirk on his face, as if my defiance was a cute but ultimately foolish gesture. He had no idea that this small act of self-reliance was just the beginning. I was quietly drawing a line in the sand, and he was too arrogant to see it. He thought this was about a tent. I was beginning to realize it was about my entire life. The weekend in the woods was exactly what I needed. The crisp mountain air, the scent of pine needles, and the crackle of the campfire at night helped to clear my head. Rachel was a godsend. She listened patiently as I recounted the entire ugly episode, her expression growing more thunderous with each detail. "They're leeches, Elsie," she said, poking the fire with a long stick. "All of them, Jacob included. They've been using you for years, and the one time you ask for a tiny favor, they show their true colors. You're not the mooch they are. Hearing her validate my feelings was like a balm on a raw wound. For 2 days, we hiked, we talked, and we didn't mention their names again. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. I felt like myself again, strong, independent, and capable. But the peace was shattered the moment I pulled into my driveway on Sunday evening. Something was wrong. I felt it before I even saw it. The air was too quiet. Usually, on a hot August evening, I would hear the gentle hum of the pool pump. Tonight, there was only silence. I got out of the car, a sense of dread coiling in my stomach. As I walked around the side of the house towards the backyard, the feeling intensified. And then I saw it. The pool was empty. My beautiful, pristine, saltwater pool was a hollowed-out concrete shell. The vibrant blue water that I had so lovingly maintained was gone, replaced by a murky, shallow puddle at the deep end. A collection of leaves and debris was scattered across the bottom, and a long, dark crack snaked its way. Why down the plaster on the far wall? It looked like a wound. My breath caught in my throat. I ran to the edge, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. How was this possible? Draining a pool of this size would take hours, if not days, with the proper equipment. It was a deliberate act. My gaze swept across the patio, and that's when I saw the note. It was a single piece of lined paper, weighed down by a rock on one of my lounge chairs. The handwriting was a familiar, looping scrawl. Bethany, S. I picked it up, my hands trembling. The message was short and brutal. Pool parties are over. Maybe this will teach you not to be such a worthless leech. The words blurred as tears of rage and disbelief welled in my eyes. This was beyond cruelty. This was a calculated act of destruction. She hadn't just drained the pool, she had damaged it. Draining a plaster pool, especially in the heat of summer, could cause the plaster to crack, shrink, and delaminate. It was a costly, catastrophic mistake for any pool owner, and Bethany, having spent a summer listening to me talk about its maintenance, would have known that. This wasn't negligence, it was malice. I stumbled back into the house, the note clutched in my fist. The house was empty. Jacob wasn't home. I called his cell phone, my heart hammering against my ribs. He answered on the third ring, his voice casual. "Hey, you're back. How was the trip?" "Where are you?" I asked, my voice tight and strained. "I'm at my mom's. We're having a barbecue." "Why, what's up?" A barbecue? They were celebrating. The image of them laughing, eating, and congratulating each other while my property lay in ruins sent a fresh wave of fury through me. "You need to come home, Jacob, now." "What's wrong? You sound weird." "Just come home," I said and hung up. I paced the kitchen, a wild energy coursing through me. I looked at the note again. Worthless leech. They had twisted my generosity into a character flaw, a weakness to be exploited and then punished. They had used my home, taken what I offered, and when I dared to ask for a fraction of that consideration in return, they had retaliated by destroying the very thing they had so eagerly consumed. When Jacob finally walked through the door an hour later, he had a cheerful, oblivious look on his face. "Hey, what was so urgent?" I didn't say a word. I just walked to the back door and pointed towards the backyard. He followed my gaze, and his smile faltered. He walked slowly towards the empty pool, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What the hell happened?" he asked, turning to look at me. I held up the note. "Your sister happened." He took the note from my hand and read it. His face went pale. He read it again, as if the words weren't making sense. She wouldn't do this," he stammered, shaking his head. "There has to be a mistake. Maybe there was a leak. Maybe the pump broke." "A leak wouldn't drain the entire pool in 2 days, Jacob," I said, my voice cold and hard. "And it wouldn't leave a handwritten confession. She did this, and I can only assume she did it with your mother's blessing and quite possibly your knowledge." "My knowledge?" He looked genuinely shocked. "I had no idea, Elsie, I swear. I would never let them do this." But his shock didn't comfort me, because while he may not have known about the act itself, he had created the environment for it to happen. He had co-signed their narrative of me as the stingy, transactional wife. He had dismissed my feelings, belittled my contributions, and sided with them at every turn. His negligence was the fertile ground in which their resentment had bloomed into this act of vandalism. "I want them out of my life, Jacob," I said, my voice low and steady. "Bethany, your mother, all of them. They are never to set foot on this property again." He looked from the empty, broken pool to my face, a flicker of fear in his eyes. He was finally starting to understand the magnitude of what had happened, but it was too late. The damage was done, not just to the pool, but to the very foundation of our marriage. The crack in the plaster was a perfect metaphor for the chasm that had just opened up between us. He started to apologize, to make excuses for them, to promise he would fix it, but I wasn't listening. I was looking at the hollowed-out heart of my backyard, the sanctuary I had built with my own hands and my own money, and I was making a silent promise to myself. They thought this was the end of the story. They thought they had taught the worthless leech a lesson. They had no idea that I was the architect, and I was about to design their ruin. The next morning, the full scope of the damage became sickeningly clear. I had a pool contractor come out to assess the situation. The man, a grizzled veteran named SIL, walked the perimeter of the empty pool, shaking his head slowly. "This is bad," he said, his voice grim. "Whoever did this knew what they were doing, or they were incredibly stupid. Draining a pool like this in the middle of a heat wave, the plaster is shot." He pointed to the long crack I had seen, then to a dozen smaller spiderweb cracks that I hadn't noticed. "This all has to be chipped out. The whole thing will need to be resurfaced. You're lucky it didn't pop out of the ground." He explained that the groundwater pressure could literally float an empty pool out of the earth, breaking pipes and destroying the entire structure. We had been lucky to avoid that, but the repair bill was still going to be astronomical. "You're looking at $15,000, maybe $20,000, Sal concluded, scribbling on his clipboard. "And it'll be a month before we can even start. We're booked solid." $20,000. The number hung in the air, a testament to the sheer vindictiveness of Bethany's actions. I thanked Sal, my mind reeling. Jacob, who had been listening to the entire assessment with a pale, drawn face, started talking as soon as Sal's truck pulled away. "I'll pay for it, Elsie," he said, his voice pleading. "I'll get the money from Bethany. She'll have to pay for it." I just looked at him. Bethany doesn't have $20, let alone $20,000. She's unemployed, and her husband works a minimum wage job. How, exactly, do you expect her to pay for this? He deflated, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, I'll figure it out. We can take out a loan." "We are not taking out a loan," I said firmly. "This was not our fault. This was a deliberate act of vandalism, and I'm going to treat it as such." That afternoon, I filed a police report. The officer who came to the house was sympathetic but practical. He took pictures of the damage and the note, but he warned me that without a direct confession or a witness, it was my word against hers. "She'll just say you're framing her because you're angry about some family squabble," he said. "It's a tough situation." He was right. I knew Bethany would lie. She would cry and play the victim, and her mother and Jacob would rally around her, painting me as a vindictive, scorned woman. I needed more than just the note. I needed irrefutable proof. My first step was to check my home security system. I had cameras covering the front door and the driveway, but I had always considered the backyard a private S. Pace hadn't installed one there, a mistake I now deeply regretted. I spent hours poring over the footage from the weekend. On Saturday morning at around 10:00 a.m., I saw Bethany's beat-up minivan pull into the driveway. She got out, but she was alone. No kids. She walked around the side of the house, towards the back gate, and disappeared from view. She was in the backyard for nearly 3 hours before the camera caught her leaving. It wasn't proof of what she did, but it placed her at the scene, alone, for a significant amount of time. Next, I needed to figure out how she had drained the pool so quickly. My pump had a drain function, but it was a slow process that would have taken days. Sal had mentioned that a professional would use a submersible pump. On a hunch, I started calling local equipment rental shops. I hit the jackpot on the third call. "Yeah, we rented a 2-inch submersible pump on Friday afternoon," the clerk at Rent-A-Tool told me. "Due back Monday morning." My heart started to beat faster. "Can you tell me who rented it?" "Sorry, ma'am, I can't give out customer information over the phone." "I understand," I said, thinking fast. "I'm a landscape architect, and a client of mine is having some drainage work done. I think they might have rented the pump from you. I just need to confirm so I can coordinate my team. The name is Jacob." It was a long shot, but I knew my husband's name was more likely to be on a rental agreement than Bethany, as she had no credit. "Let me check," the clerk said. I heard the clacking of a keyboard. "Yep, here it is. Jacob, rented Friday at 4:30 p.m. I felt a cold wave wash over me. Jacob, he hadn't just been complicit, he had been an active participant. He had rented the very tool used to destroy our property. His shock, his apologies, his promises to fix it, all of it had been a lie. He had known, he had helped. The knowledge was a physical blow. I sat down on a kitchen chair, the phone still pressed to my ear, my vision tunneling. The betrayal was so profound, so complete, that I felt hollowed out. He had stood there that morning, feigning shock and concern, knowing he was the one who had provided the means for his sister's destruction. But the hollow feeling was quickly replaced by something else. Ice. A cold, clear, unshakable fury took root in my heart. The game had changed. This wasn't just about getting Bethany to pay for the damage anymore. This was about dismantling the entire rotten structure of lies and deceit that my husband and his family had built. I spent the rest of the day in a state of meticulous, focused calm. I drove to the rental shop, and using Jacob's name and a story about him sending me to pay the bill, I got a copy of the rental agreement. His signature was right there at the bottom. I now had the security footage of Bethany arriving and the rental agreement with Jacob's name on it. The pieces were starting to fit together. My next call was to my best friend, Rachel. I laid out the whole situation, my voice low and even. She listened without interrupting. "That miserable, lying snake," she breathed when I told her about the pump. "Elsie, what are you going to do?" "I'm going to do what I do best," I replied, looking out the window at the ruined pool. "I'm an architect. I'm going to gather my materials, draw up a blueprint, and then I'm going to tear their entire world down to the studs." Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have a friend who works in the fraud investigation department at the county assessor's office. I don't know if it's helpful, but she's very good at digging up things people don't want found." A new idea began to form in my mind, a plan far more intricate and devastating than simply suing them for damages. Bethany and her husband were always complaining about money, yet there were small inconsistencies. A new designer handbag she'd shown off, a weekend trip they'd taken that seemed beyond their means. And then there was Rosie, the retired teacher living in a surprisingly large house, always pleading poverty but never seeming to struggle. "Rachel," I said, a slow smile spreading across my face for the first time in days, "I think I'd very much like to speak with your friend." The investigation was no longer just about the pool, it was about everything, and I was just getting started. The next 2 weeks were a study in compartmentalization. On the surface, I was the grieving wife, allowing Jacob to believe I had accepted his half-hearted apologies and empty promises. He was overly attentive, making me dinner, offering back rubs, and constantly talking about how they would make it right. He claimed Bethany had confessed to him in a tearful phone call, saying she just wanted to scare me and hadn't understood the damage it would cause. He said he had only rented the pump because she had told him there was a leak and she was trying to help me by draining it before it got worse. The Y's were so laughably thin, but I pretended to believe every word. I played my part, all while quietly gathering the ammunition I needed. My meeting with Rachel's friend, a sharp-witted woman named Maria, was a revelation. We met for coffee, and I laid out the basic facts. Bethany and her husband were perpetually broke, yet occasionally displayed signs of unexplained income. Rosie, my mother-in-law, lived in a house that seemed well above a retired teacher's pension. Maria nodded, her eyes alight with professional curiosity. "It's amazing what you can find in public records if you know where to look," she said. "Property deeds, tax assessments, liens, bankruptcies, it all tells a story." She gave me a crash course in navigating the county's online databases. Armed with this new knowledge, I began to dig. My first discovery was small but significant. 3 years ago, Rosie had received a home improvement grant from a state program designed to help low-income seniors make necessary repairs. She had claimed her roof was failing and received $10,000. It was a grant, not a loan, so it never had to be paid back. I remembered that time well. She had complained for months about the leaky roof, a problem that seemed to miraculously vanish right after she received the check. I also remembered that she had never actually gotten the roof replaced. Instead, she'd had her driveway repaved. It wasn't illegal, but it was certainly unethical. It showed a willingness to exploit systems for personal gain. The next piece of the puzzle came from Bethany's social media. She wasn't smart enough to keep her profiles private. I scrolled back through years of posts, a nauseating highlight reel of her life. Amidst the photos of her kids and the passive-aggressive memes about fake people, I found what I was looking for. She ran a small, unofficial side business baking elaborate custom cakes for birthdays and weddings. She posted dozens of pictures of her creations, often with captions like, "Another happy customer." So glad I could make their day special. Her clients would comment, thanking her and praising her work. It was a cash business, entirely under the table. On its own, it wasn't a crime lord's enterprise, but I cross-referenced it with another public record, her application for state-funded childcare assistance. On the application, she had declared zero income, claiming to be a completely dependent stay-at-home mom. She was defrauding the state, taking a spot from a family who truly needed it, all while earning unreported cash. But the final, most damning piece of information came from a deep dive into the property records for Rosie's house. Rosie had owned her home for over 40 years. When her husband passed away a decade ago, she had become the sole owner. But 5 years ago, something had changed. The deed had been amended. A quitclaim deed had been filed, adding Jacob to the title of the house as a joint tenant with right of survivorship. My blood ran cold as I stared at the document on my computer screen. This meant that when Rosie passed away, the house would bypass probate and go directly to Jacob, free and clear. Bethany would get nothing. This was Rosie's way of ensuring her favored child, her golden boy, got the entire inheritance. Suddenly, Jacob's unwavering loyalty to his mother and sister made perfect, sickening sense. He wasn't just defending them out of some misguided family obligation. He was protecting his investment. His entire financial future was tied to staying in his mother's good graces. And his sister, Bethany, she was being played for a fool. She defended her mother and brother with a ferocity born of a belief in their family's solidarity, completely unaware that they had already cut her out of the single most valuable asset the family possessed. The dynamic was clear. Rosie held the power, Jacob was the heir apparent, and Bethany was the disposable pawn, useful for her loyalty, but ultimately destined to be left with nothing. I now had everything I needed. The blueprint was complete. I had evidence of Bethany's welfare fraud. I had evidence of Rosie's grant misuse. And I had the explosive secret of the quitclaim deed, the key that would detonate their carefully constructed family alliance. And tying it all together was the act of vandalism against my pool, the catalyst for their downfall. I had the security footage, the rental agreement with Jacob's signature, and a notarized estimate for the $20,000 in damages. My plan had evolved beyond simple revenge. This was about justice. It was about exposing them for the frauds they were, not just to me, but to the world and, most deliciously, to each other. I spent the next few days putting the final touches on my plan. I contacted a lawyer to understand the best way to present my findings. I made copies of all the documents, The rental agreement, the deed, screenshots of Bethany's business page, and the state assistance applications, Rosie's grant approval. I compiled everything into 3 neat, separate folders, each one labeled with a name: Bethany, Rosie, Jacob. The final step was to set the stage. I told Jacob that I had decided to handle the pool situation privately within the family. I told him I wanted to have a meeting at our house with him, Bethany, and Rosie, so we could all talk face to face and come to an agreement on a payment plan. He was visibly relieved. "That's a great idea, Elle," he said, kissing my forehead. "I knew you'd be reasonable. It's better to keep this between us." "Exactly," I said, my smile feeling foreign on my face. "Let's do it this Sunday. We can have a nice, calm discussion." He eagerly agreed and made the calls. They were all set to arrive at 2:00 p.m. on Sunday. They would walk into my home expecting a negotiation with a woman they believed they had successfully intimidated. They were expecting a doormat. They were about to be introduced to an architect, and I had built them a prison of their own making. Sunday afternoon was warm and bright, a beautiful day for a reckoning. I set the stage in our living room, the same room where Jacob had called me a mooch. I placed 4 chairs in a formal arrangement. On the coffee table in the center, I laid out 3 crisp, manila folders. Jacob came downstairs, looking nervous but hopeful. "Are you sure about this, Elsie? Maybe I should just talk to them alone first." "No," I said, my voice calm and even. "We're all adults. We'll sort this out together." The doorbell rang at precisely 2:00 p.m. Jacob let in his mother and sister. Rosie swept in with an air of regal condescension, while Bethany shuffled behind her, refusing to make eye contact with me. She was trying to project defiance, but I could see the fear flickering in her eyes. "Elsie," Rosie began, her voice oozing false sympathy, "I am so sorry about this whole misunderstanding. Bethany feels just terrible. She's not herself lately." "Please have a seat," I said, gesturing to the chairs. I waited until they were all settled before I sat down opposite them. Jacob sat beside me, a nervous twitch in his leg. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment, enjoying the uncomfortable squirming. "Thank you for coming," I began, my voice cool and professional. "I've decided that going through the police or the courts would be messy and unpleasant for everyone, so I've come up with a more direct solution." Jacob smiled weakly, relieved. Bethany and Rosie exchanged a look of triumph. They thought they had won. "Let's start with you, Bethany," I said, picking up the first folder and opening it. I slid a stack of papers across the coffee table towards her. "This is a collection of screenshots from your cake baking business, alongside a copy of your application for state childcare assistance, on which you claimed 0 income. This is commonly known as fraud. The penalty for which, in this state, includes up to 5 years in prison and full financial restitution of all benefits received. I have a contact at the Department of Health and Human Services who is very interested in seeing these documents." Bethany's face went white. She stared at the papers, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. Rosie's eyes widened, her condescending smile vanishing. "Now, Rosie," I said, turning to my mother-in-law and picking up the second folder. "This is a copy of your application for a $10,000 low-income senior home repair grant, which you received for a failing roof. It also includes a satellite image of your house from last month, showing the same 30-year-old shingles it's had for a decade, and a copy of the invoice from the company that repaved your driveway the month after you received the funds. That's grant fraud. A felony." Rosie paled, her hand flying to her chest. I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do," I said evenly. "And finally, Jacob." I saved the last folder for him, but I didn't push it across the table. I held it in my lap. "We'll get to your part in this in a moment." I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a low, serious tone. "Here is my offer. The damage to my pool is $20,000. I have the invoice right here." I placed it on the table. "You too," I said, looking at Bethany and Rosie, "will pay me that amount in full. I don't care how you get it. Sell your cars, cash out your retirement funds, take out a loan. You have 30 days. In exchange for that payment, the evidence of your respective fraudulent activities will not be forwarded to the relevant authorities. Bethany started to sob, a pathetic, gulping sound. I don't have that kind of money, you know I don't. That sounds like a personal problem, I replied without emotion. You should have considered that before you decided to vandalize my property. You can't prove I did anything, Rosie spat, regaining a sliver of her usual fire. That note is meaningless. Is it? I asked calmly. Because I also have security footage of Bethany arriving here alone on the day the pool was drained and staying for 3 hours. And more importantly, I have a copy of the rental agreement for the industrial-grade water pump that was used, an agreement that was signed by my husband, Jacob. I turned my head to look at Jacob. He looked like he had been punched in the gut. His face was ashen. Bethany's head snapped up, her tear-streaked face turning from me to her brother. You rented the pump. She told me there was a leak. Jacob stammered, looking wildly between us. But this is where it gets truly interesting, I continued, ignoring him. I opened the third folder and pulled out the final document. I slid it across the table towards Bethany. Do you know what this is, Bethany? She picked it up with a trembling hand. Rosie leaned over to look, her face a mask of confusion. It's a quitclaim deed, I explained, my voice as sharp as a shard of glass. Filed 5 years ago, it adds Jacob to the title of your mother's house. When she passes, he gets everything. The house, the property, all of it, you, Bethany, have been written out. You get nothing. You've spent years defending them, acting as their loyal attack dog, and they've already betrayed you in the most fundamental way imaginable. The silence that followed was absolute. Bethany stared at the deed, then her eyes lifted to her mother, and then to her brother. The dawning horror and comprehension on her face was a sight to behold. The loyalty, the family unity, it all evaporated in that single moment, replaced by the raw, ugly truth of their greed and deception. Is this true? Bethany whispered, her voice cracking. Mom. Rosie couldn't meet her daughter's eyes. Jacob just stared at the floor, his jaw working silently. Bethany let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She threw the deed back on the table. You were never going to give me anything. All this time, she turned to Jacob. And you knew, you let me fight your battles, you let me make myself the villain, all while you had this tucked away. The room exploded. Bethany launched herself at Jacob, screaming, her fists flailing. Rosie was shouting at her to stop. It was a grotesque, pathetic spectacle of a family devouring itself. I just sat there, watching the architecture of their lives, built on a foundation of lies, collapse into dust. I had given them the blueprint to their own destruction, and they had followed it perfectly. In the end, I didn't have to do anything else. The seeds of discord I had planted that afternoon grew into a thorny, tangled mess that choked the life out of their family. Bethany, fueled by a rage born of a lifetime of feeling second best and now confirmed betrayal, gave her mother an ultimatum. Either Rosie sold the house immediately and split the proceeds 3 ways, 1/3 for her, 1 for Jacob, and 1 for Bethany, or Bethany would not only refuse to pay me a single cent, but she would also go to the authorities herself with information about Rosie's grant fraud. She had nothing left to lose. Rosie, terrified of losing her comfortable retirement and facing a felony charge, caved. The house, the symbol of her power and Jacob's inheritance, went on the market a week later. The beautiful irony was that the hot housing market meant it sold quickly, but after capital gains, taxes, and fees, the amount each of them received was significantly less than they had imagined. True to my word, once the $20,000 was wired to my account, I put the folders of evidence into my home shredder. I had no interest in seeing them in jail. The destruction of their family unit was a far more fitting punishment. Jacob, of course, was a wreck. He tried to apologize, to explain, to bargain. He said he had been scared of his mother, that he had never known how to stand up to her. He swore he had always planned to do right by his sister after their mother was gone. The excuses were pathetic and transparent. You didn't just let them disrespect me, Jacob. I told him during our last conversation. You actively participated. You rented the pump. You stood by and called me a mooch. You valued a future inheritance more than you valued your own wife. There is nothing left to say. I filed for divorce. Our house, which I had paid the down payment on and funded the renovations for, became a point of contention. But my lawyer was excellent. We presented the evidence of the vandalism and Jacob's complicity as part of a pattern of domestic economic abuse. Faced with a potentially devastating court battle, he agreed to a settlement. He walked away with a small fraction of the equity, just enough to start over somewhere else. I kept the house, my house. The last I heard, Jacob was living in a small apartment across town. His relationship with Bethany was non-existent, and his relationship with his mother was strained, poisoned by resentment over the forced sale of the house. Rosie was living in a seniors' condo complex, her queenly status revoked. Bethany, after getting her share of the money, had apparently left her husband and moved to another state with her kids, wanting a fresh start away from the family that had used and discarded her. They were all scattered, isolated, and miserable. As for me, the first thing I did after the divorce was final was call SIL, the pool contractor. The repairs took a month, but it was worth every penny. The day they finished refilling it, the water was a brilliant, sparkling blue, purer and cleaner than it had ever been. That weekend, I invited Rachel over. We floated on loungers, sipping cool drinks under the summer sun. The only sounds were the gentle hum of the new pump, the chirping of birds in the garden I had so carefully cultivated, and our laughter. There were no screaming children, no passive-aggressive in-laws, no ungrateful husband. My backyard was a sanctuary once more. But this time, it was all mine. I had been tested, betrayed, and broken down. But like any good architect, I knew that sometimes you have to tear down a rotten structure to the foundation before you can build something new, something beautiful, and something strong enough to stand on its own.